I was recently asked if I could put together a tutorial for a brand new quilter. Absolutely, let's do that. If you don't know me, hi, I'm Ellie. I teach people how to quilt. Let's start with the basics. I usually encourage people just to start with a simple square kind of quilt. It doesn't matter how big your squares are, but definitely make sure that they are all the same size. So I got these from some leftover scraps that I have. They all kind of coordinate together, and I have them cut to 9 inches by 9 inches each. And cutting is one of the most important things that you need to practice as a beginner, because if you aren't making sure that everything is at a right angle or making sure that everything is cut exactly to how the pattern says, the sizes aren't the right way, it's not gonna fit together. Quilting is kind of like a puzzle, so you gotta make sure that your puzzle pieces are exactly how they need to be. So I'm going to be doing 9 squares that are 9 by 9 each, and this will give me a really cute floral infant quilt. So I've chosen 9 pieces that coordinate well together, and we're gonna lay them out in a row of 3, 3, and 3. Personally, for beginners, I would recommend doing something large, like a 9, 10, maybe even a 12-inch block. The smaller you go, sometimes the more difficult it can be because you have more seams that you're gonna have to line up. So do something a little bit big. And our first step is just going to be grab 2 squares, and we're gonna put them right sides together. So I'm gonna start with this one and this one, and I'm simply going to lay them right sides together, meaning that the right side of the fabric goes together, and then I'm gonna make sure that they match up here and pin it. So we have our pieces right sides together, they are pinned. So let's go over to our sewing machine and let's sew them with a 1/4 inch seam here. Quilting seams are always at a 1/4 of an inch, and a standard stitch length for quilting is usually 2, 2.5. And never sew over your pins. So now we've sewn our 2 pieces together, and you can see how if we open it up, we've started our first block that's gonna go at the top. We can add on our 3rd piece, or depending on how you like to do it, you can also press these and then go on to your 3rd one. Now there's always debate in the quilting community of should we press our seams to the side or press them open. Personally, I press them open. You feel free to just do whatever you like. But what is important is that you just press your seams. Don't iron and move things around like this. Just go up and down and press. If you're moving your iron around, you might end up with wavy seams and your quilt gets all wonky on you. And now that we finished those 2, let's repeat that same process by adding our 3rd block onto what was the last block. We're gonna pin it and do a 1/4 inch seam. So now we have a finished first row. Go do the same thing with your other 2. So now that we have all 3 rows put together, here's the next step. Just like when we were starting to put our blocks together, we put them right sides together, we're gonna do the same thing with our rows. So take your top 2 rows and lay them right sides together. And then we're gonna pin along here where we want to join them. Now, as a new quilter, you might be very tempted to start at the top and pin it all the way to the bottom. That's not how we do it as quilters. You're gonna wanna start by pinning at your seams. And then you can go back and add an extra pin or 2 if you need to. So you can see here my seams perfectly line up, and I've pinned it on this side because as I sew down here, I can stop right there and take my pin out. And then I know that my seam will stay in place. And then you're going to press your entire row. Look how great those points are. So now that we've joined together and pressed our first 2 rows here, it's time for us to add our 3rd row on. And we're gonna do that exactly the same process. Flip it over, and we're going to be pinning all along here. So now we're pinned, and we sew, and we press, and there you have your very first beginner quilt top. Now, if you used the 9-inch squares like I did, it might be a little bit small, but this is a perfect size for an infant, like a newborn infant. If you want something a little bit bigger, maybe something that's gonna grow with them, you might wanna consider adding a border, and I can show you how that looks now. So my quilt is just about 27 inches long and wide. So I'm gonna take some other scrap fabric that I have. I'm gonna cut some 3-inch borders. And the way that you add borders onto any of your quilts is opposite sides first. So I'm gonna do left and right, and then I'll press those and trim them. Now here's the difference about putting borders on your quilts. In the earlier parts of this tutorial, I was showing you how we need to match up our seams and be very careful when we're pinning things. If you're just using a single strip of fabric like this as a border, meaning that you don't have pieces where you're gonna have to match up a seam, you can just pin it all along here and you can start at the top and go down, and it doesn't matter exactly where you're pinning because you're not having to match up any seams. And here you can see I've pinned the borders on opposite sides. We're gonna sew these first and then press and trim, and then we'll come back to do the top and bottom part. And again, we're sewing with a 1/4 inch seam, and then we press both sides. And then next we need to square this up. So the longer ruler you have, the better. This is a 6x24. You're gonna get long straight lines. So line it up and then trim off that part. And once you have it trimmed, you can start on your other two sides. And here's the last two borders added on. Now, something you need to think about if you're gonna be adding borders onto your quilts is that you don't want to cut all 4 pieces the size of your quilt top. Yes, I learned that the hard way as a new quilter. So the way that I like to do it is I measure the first 2 and cut them according to what my quilt top size is. And then I sew them on, press it, square it up, and when I'm all done with that process, then I will measure the last 2 pieces because it's gonna be your quilt top plus the size of the 2 borders that you added on. And seam allowance can be kind of tricky for new quilters to learn the math on. So I say just do it all and then measure it when you're done. Then we press both borders again. We do a final squaring up, and here is our final quilt top. Now, because you're a new quilter, you're gonna wanna know what to do after that. Here's what you do. Click on my picture, it'll take you to my profile, and then click on these quilting tutorials that are in my playlist. You'll see a 12-part series about quilt finishing.